If you're following along in my book, Deep and Wide, and I just happened to be wearing that shirt today, really because I was looking for something red, but if you've been following along in my book, Deep and Wide, you know that I'm also uh, this year posting a podcast every time we move to a new book of the Bible. And on January 14th is when we arrive at the book of Exodus. Now, the book of Exodus is part of the five books of the Bible that we look at as being the letters of Moses, the not letters, but the books of Moses. And early on um, during the time that Jesus was on earth, there were groups of people that had a lot of the Old Testament scriptures as what they called the Torah. But when we got into looking at the differences between the Samaritans and the Jews at that time, the Samaritans only used the five books of Moses and nothing else. Um, some of their priests and leaders taught them that if it wasn't written by Moses, then it doesn't count. We kind of get into that today when people argue about what's part of the Bible and what's not. People say, so we reject that. And the Bible is a collection of books. There's a difference between the Protestant Bible and the Catholic Bible. There are other denominations that have canonized a slightly different collection of books of the Bible, but for the most part, we use um, uh, in the Protestant faith, we have a pretty standard Bible of the 66 books, and um, in the Catholic Bible, I don't know how many there are, but there are others that are included in the Catholic Bible as well. I have a book over on my shelf. It's called The Lost Books of Bibles, and it's a collection of other books that were considered for inclusion in the Bible, but they were rejected for whatever reason. So if you're interested, you can actually read those other texts as well. But when we're looking at specifically Exodus, I almost have to back up to the end of Genesis when we have the story of Joseph. I really like the story of Joseph. I have a lot of questions about Joseph. Someday, if I live long enough, I would like to do an in-depth study in the person of Joseph. Also, Daniel. There are a couple of men in the Bible that I would like to study a little more, and maybe I don't know. My vision is not good enough to work a lot on the computer. That's why I started doing the podcast, because, well, I can do that. However, editing the videos is almost as tedious as actually using the computer as my tool for organizing my thoughts and writing those. But I really am fascinated with a few characters in the Bible that I'd like to study more. Uh, Obviously, I'd like to study more the individual disciples, the 12 disciples, especially some we don't know much about. But I don't think there are any resources where I could really do that. If you know some good resources, drop the comments in, because I would be interested in that. Like Matthew, we don't know a lot about Matthew. What we know about Matthew is in his writings, but he was very methodical and factual in the book of Matthew, so there's not a lot of interpretation, or we really don't have any good ideas into looking into the disciples. I am a fan of the video series The Chosen. Don't know how they're going to work through a lot of the things. I'm hoping to remain a fan of them as they go through their whole process of completing their 7 seasons. But they probably had some difficulty. Okay, how are we going to portray these 12 disciples when we don't know much about them? So I'd like to know more about the disciples, but I really am fascinated with Joseph, David, Daniel, Isaiah and Jeremiah, um, Elijah and Elisha. That's 7, and I have a list somewhere of men that I'd really like to study their lives more and put a collection about those people. Will I ever do that? I don't know. And if I did, would I be able visually to put that in a book? But today we are focused on the book of Exodus. In my book, Deep and Wide, I call it Exodus the Redeemed. Like I said, when I started writing this book, I started the writings for this book in 1994. So I spent many years finishing this, although there were big chunks of time where I didn't do much of the writing. Obviously, when my sons were in the little league age, and up through junior high and getting into band and things, I started working on my first master's, got a third of that finished and decided that wasn't the degree I wanted, so then I did another master's, and then worked on my doctorate and things like that, as well as maintaining my career. There were big chunks of time where I did not work on that, but big chunks of it were done during the pandemics when I finished that. However, when I go back and look at the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and a lot of the portions of my older work on that, there are things I would do differently today. I would not have called it Exodus the Redeemed. I would have called it Exodus, the story of Moses and Moses in charge. And so if Moses wrote it, then it's very autobiographical. So Exodus, to me, is the story of Moses. And more than that, it's like Moses explaining how he built structures to help control these people, really. So when we look at Exodus, it's really difficult to say when Moses was born. And if you don't know when Moses was born, then you really can't date the time that he wrote these 5 books. But a lot of people say they put the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy as being written around 1445. And in my book, I kind of use that as 1445 BC or BCE. And that's probably not accurate. If you do a search, I made some notes today. I didn't want to go completely without notes like I did with Job because it ran a little long. If we look, there are big groups of people that believe that Moses was born somewhere in the 1300 BCE, and other people believe around 1571 BCE. The Jewish community and we do find a lot of really good research within the Jewish faith because especially when you're looking at the Old Testament, big chunks of the Old Testament are part of the religious texts that the Jewish community of faith uses. So there are the Jewish community faith kind of has come into the belief that Moses was born in 1391 BCE and died about 1271 BCE. I read an article that kind of talked about, okay, if we want to look at when Moses was born and when Moses died, let's look for some other information. And so trying to identify when was the 40 years wandering around in the desert. Okay. We know Moses, we know that in the Bible it says Moses lived to be 120 years old. And we know he died before he entered the Promised Land. We'll talk about the Promised Land in Numbers or Deuteronomy. I forget which, but we will talk more about that. I have some ideas to stir your brain on that. But so if we know that they want, if we know it, if we believe and know because we believe that Moses lived to be 120 years old and that they wandered around in the desert for 40 years. So 1440 BCE would be when they left Egypt. So if they left Egypt in 1440 BCE, then Moses couldn't have written these 5 books in 1445, because that would have him writing these books 5 years before he left Egypt. So, or 5 years before the Exodus. So if they left in 1440 BCE, then Moses died in 1400 BCE. If I'm going to focus only on the time they left, the Israelites left Egypt and then entered the Promised Land, that difference of 40 years, and we know who rulers were, and we know historically when events happened, I'm going to go with that. Okay, and there's tons of people that disagree with me. In fact, this does not align with all of the history and research of people of the Jewish faith. But anyway, so when I look at when Exodus was probably written, well, it had to be after the time they left, because when we're looking at Exodus, we talk about, when Moses gets the 10 Commandments, there's so many people that Moses is so busy trying to solve all the little problems that Moses' father-in-law tells us, you can't do all this. You need to set up judges who are responsible for all these different groups. And so actually Moses' father-in-law is pretty responsible for the structures of setting up judges, which led Moses and his father-in-law to think, okay, well, you need rules for all these people, because if you've got all these judges, how are you going to ensure that this person is presented with a problem and this person over here is presented with a problem and they solve it in the same way? You need some rules and punishments and all this stuff. And so Exodus would have been written after they left, but I would think early on in that 40 years, so probably around 1430 BCE. That would be 10 years in to the wandering in the desert, and it probably happened before that, probably. So somewhere within that first 10 years. So I'm going to place the book of Exodus at 1430 BCE. I haven't read anything where anyone else agrees with me on that time, but I'm basing all of that on the Exodus from Egypt and entering the Promised Land, that being a 40-year span. Moses died at that time. He would have been 120. And so I'm backtracking everything to that. They had to be wandering around in the desert from 1440 to 1400 BCE. So obviously, where in my book, Deep and Wide, where I say that this was written in 1445 BCE, well, I'm disagreeing with myself at this point, because that couldn't be possible, because that means this would have been written 5 years before they left. Part of Genesis might be that way. While Moses ran away from Egypt on his own, and then met who would become his father-in-law and got married and had a couple of kids out there. It could be that while he was out there, he wrote down all the history of the people that he knew. So if Moses truly is a person who wrote down the history of their people that had been passed down from the book of Genesis, it's possible that he wrote the book of Genesis before taking the people out of Egypt. Genesis could have been written in 1445 BCE. So when we're looking at Exodus, what's the important things to know and understand? Well, this is where we get the story of Moses. So Moses is writing about his birth and who he was, things like that. But at some point, I mean, Moses is not writing about those things as they're happening, obviously. So this is where farther in his life, probably after, it has to be after they have exited. The book of Exodus is where we find the Ten Commandments. I find it very curious to look at the story of the Ten Commandments. And I sometimes wondered, especially when you read the Ten Commandments, some of them are like, duh, like, so do you really need to have a rule so the people knew they weren't supposed to do that? Some of those things seems kind of silly to me, but at the very basics of who they were at that time, they needed some structure. So that was the structure that get them going. Then when people had problems, they'd come to Moses, because Moses was the leader, and he would have to solve all their problems. And this became unsupportable. He could not do all these as one person with all of these thousands and thousands of people. And so Moses' father-in-law, so this had to be, they had gotten from Egypt back to where Moses' father-in-law, I guess where Moses had left his wife and children as he went back to get the people. So some time had happened, and so Moses' father-in-law says to him, you can't do all this on your own. You need to get some leaders to help you. And so he set up judges to help. But then I can almost see they had problems with setting up these judges to help because how this person rules in solving a problem and how this person rules in solving a problem, and how do we look at justice and equity across that? Those concepts sound familiar to you? And so Moses then began to write rules and punishments. I think they call it rules and penalties. So if you look at the book of Exodus, starting in chapter 20, verse 20, and going through chapter 25, it's all about rules and penalties, not so that the people knew what they were supposed to do and not supposed to do and keep all the rules, but so the judges could be fair and equitable in what they do when the people mess up, or solving disputes between two people, or whatever. So it was all about justice and equity across the big population, and so that each leader would know how to do things so it was fair and equitable for everyone. And then chapters 26 through 40 were all the rules about the tabernacle, the church, and the Sabbath, and what you do to keep the Sabbath holy and make sure that you have a day of rest. And I saw something recently, and I don't even know where. I don't know if it was in something I watched or something I read, but someone said, well, it's not about keeping the Sabbath holy, but it's about having that Sabbath or day of rest where we pause long enough to realize that all days are holy. I haven't really worked all that through in my brain, but I kind of like that the way it is. The reason we have Sunday to slow down, focus on our spirituality and our worship, is so that we remember not that that's the day to do it, but we remember this is what I'm supposed to be doing every day. And so I pause to focus only on that for a portion of my today in my world. On Sunday, I spend a portion to do that so that I remember that that's how I'm supposed to be focused every day. So it's that time where I focus that, okay, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Remember to be focused, be centered, know what it is you're supposed to be doing, what you're about, your calling. Why is it you do what you do? I may focus on that 3 or 4 hours every Sunday, But it's not about doing that on Sunday. It's about doing that consistently at that specific time so that I remember that that's what I'm supposed to do every day. So I kind of like that. You remember to keep the Sabbath holy. Why? So that we're reminded that's how we're supposed to treat all days. I really like that. And that's something I just read or saw or something last week. It entered my brain. I don't remember the details where it came from. Hopefully it wasn't a copyrighted something, because I just kind of, well, I don't know where it was from. I have no idea. Okay, some other things that I want to point out. And anytime you're studying the Old Testament, this is going to come up. The Old Testament is a collection of writings and stories that tell us the story of an ancient people. And the people that wrote those stories were part of that group of people. So they are telling their own story, or the story of their own people, which tends to be autobiographical. Okay? So it is possible for me to believe their story because they're telling their story, but it's also possible for me to believe that some of their beliefs were wrong. I'm sure you have all encountered someone, maybe even in your church, where you maybe you've heard a preacher or a guest preacher or someone, and they preach or teach something that doesn't align with what you believe. I'm sure everyone has encountered that, where you heard someone speak or preach or teach, and you're thinking, no, that's not exactly right. I don't believe it that way. Okay. Well, the same thing happens when we see people that are thousands of years ago writing stories about people that happened thousands of years ago before them, or they're sharing their beliefs about the world and around them. Remember, at the time they wrote this, Earth was flat, and the sun and the stars and moon were these little bitty things that did this around Earth. And you know, now we know that's not the way it is. We know Earth is a sphere and very, very small compared to everything else. So these people were telling the story of their people, which included their beliefs about the world and things and how they interacted in that world. And they're telling that. So I can both look at the Old Testament. Specifically now we're looking at Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Job, which would be the 6 books of the Bible that are probably the oldest. Sorry, something is itching me on my face, and I don't know what it is. So it is possible for me to both believe the stories of the Old Testament as being accurate stories written about a group of ancient people by people that were part of this ancient group of people. And it's also possible for me to read it and recognize that some of the things they believed and told about their own people wasn't exactly correct. Okay? Both of those things can coexist at the same time. Here's an example. Exodus 21:17 says that if someone curses their parent, they must be put to death. Okay, that was one of the rules. So if someone comes to one of the judges and said, hey, Joe Bob cursed his parent, and over here at this judge, someone comes and says, Hezedoofus cursed his parent. Well, now they know what to do. They have to be killed. So it doesn't matter if Joe Bob curses his parent and it's brought before this judge, and Hezedoofus curses his parents brought to this judge. They now know that it's wrong to curse your parent, and if you do so, the penalty is death. So this judge and this judge then murder Joe Bob and Hezedoofus. Okay? Because now, based on the guidance, the leadership, or the interference of Moses' father-in-law. We're not quite sure which, might be all three. There are now rules. If this happens, here's the punishment. So Exodus 21:17 says if someone curses the parent, they must be murdered. They must be put to death. Okay? The writings from Exodus now means that this judge and this judge can carry out these rules and penalties fairly. But wait a second. Exodus 20, chapter 13 says, thou shalt not murder. So if murder is wrong, when you're looking at the structure of Exodus, the Ten Commandments came first. These are the important. In the story of Exodus, these are the commandments that were given on the stone tablets by God to Moses for the people. And then the people, or the humans, are Moses and his father-in-law, created penalties for doing wrong things, like cursing your parent. Does that really come from the Ten Commandment, honor your father and mother? Or is that in an interpretation of that? And then that interpretation is applied, you didn't honor your mother and father, and I'm going to hang that on this specific Ten Commandment, and I'm going to then murder you. Whoops-a-daisy, I just broke a Ten Commandment. So what we see in a lot of the Old Testament rules, and when we get all the way to the time of Jesus, when there's 633 or 613, I don't have that correct number in my mind, but there were over 600 rules that the people had to follow to prove that they were good enough, to prove that they were holy. And anyone, specifically their community and their priests and their churches, would point out if they messed up, because they had to control everybody in this way. So it went from the Ten Commandments to everything else in Exodus, and as time goes on, the people had 630 or 613, over 600 rules that they all had to follow. And in many cases, these rules became loopholes to doing the real right and avoiding the real wrong. Whether you're focused on the Ten Commandments, or I prefer to focus on the Beatitudes, because that's when Jesus is explaining where they're messed up. Jesus explains it's not about the Ten Commandments or the 600 rules. It's about these Beatitudes. I think there's 9 of them, depending how you break them up. So it's not about rules and then loopholes to the rules. So here's a loophole in Exodus. You're not supposed to murder someone, but it's okay to murder someone if they curse their parent. That's illogical. That's illogical. And it's okay for me to look at Exodus and point out the things that are illogical. Because when I read Exodus, I need to know and understand that I am reading the history and beliefs about an ancient group of people that's being written by someone who is a part of their culture and civilization. And it's okay for me to read that and recognize that there's a discrepancy right here in Exodus. And that doesn't mean that I'm saying the Bible's garbage, let's gather them all and burn them, and let's have no more religion because I found this inconsistency. I'm not attacking the Bible because I recognize there's inconsistency in the book of Exodus. Because I have to know and understand that the book of Exodus was a book that was written thousands of years ago about events, Exodus, what was possibly written in time with how things happened, maybe not too far behind. but it was written thousands of years ago about the events taking place in a group of ancient people by someone living in that ancient group of people's culture, civilization, and what was happening to them at that time. I can believe Exodus because they're writing about what happened and what they believe. Yeah, I believe that. I can also believe they're wrong, silly, stupid on lots of the things they said, did, and how they carried out their plan of living good lives following God. And mostly their motivation was off. I mean, they're believing they had to do this or God was going to get them. Why are you good? Because if you're not, God's going to get you? Or are you good because being good is the right thing to do? Okay. This was supposed to be a really short one on Exodus. In fact, the whole last week I've been thinking, what am I going to say about Exodus? You know, what am I going to say when I get to Lamentations? There's nothing to say. It's kind of like yawn. Who wants to talk about some of those? But anyway, here I find myself, and I got plenty to talk about Exodus. Maybe that's my gift. I can talk about anything, or I can talk about nothing at all. Well, if you enjoy this content, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for watching.